Welcome to Mysterious Clues, where we uncover hidden truths and unsolved mysteries from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. It was a crisp October evening when the telegram arrived, sharp-edged and brief, like a slap across the face. Hercule Poirot, resplendent in a dove-grey suit and sipping a tisane at his flat on Whitehaven Mansions, turned the folded slip of paper over once in his fingers, as though gauging its moral weight before reading the words. The fire crackled softly beside him. Outside, the London sky bruised into purple dusk. Mon Dieu, he murmured after reading it twice. What a curious name for a place. Young Men in Velvet. What can it mean, eh? The message came from Inspector Edward Cray of the Devon Constabulary. An earnest, if slightly flustered fellow Poirot had assisted on a jewel theft 2 winters ago. It read, "Urgent. Unexplained death at private estate known as Young Men in Velvet, Dartmoor. Circumstances bizarre. Discretion needed. Owner requests you specifically. Will send car." Poirot's eyebrow rose 1/8 of an inch. Not many requested him by name these days. The young ones, the police inspectors with their gadgets, the newspapers with their insipid columns, had begun to call him passé. But the truly clever, he knew, still understood. Crimes of the soul required no fingerprint powder. The next morning he departed London wrapped in autumn elegance, gloves of pearl suede, a camel-coloured coat, and a single crimson carnation at his lapel. Hastings was abroad, Argentina again, and Poirot found the absence oddly tranquil. He read quietly during the journey and watched as the urban grey gave way to rolling green, then wild, wind-torn stretches of moor. By late afternoon, the car crested a winding hill, and the estate loomed into view. The house itself was peculiar, one of those early 20th century country properties built by society eccentrics, with more taste than tradition. It was angular, pale stone, with sweeping modern windows and Art Deco railings. But what caught the eye immediately were the 4 life-sized bronze statues positioned at the front lawn, young men in velvet tunics, each poised mid-dance, their limbs graceful, almost in flight. They stood in a perfect diamond formation. "Young men in velvet," Poirot repeated under his breath, stepping out of the motor car. How very theatrical. He was met by Inspector Cray himself, who looked more worn than Poirot remembered. His trench coat dusted in moorland mist, and his mouth set in a hard, uneasy line. "Thank you for coming so quickly, monsieur," Cray said, shaking his hand with cool fingers. "It's not the sort of thing we want spreading in the papers. You'll see why." "And the deceased?" Poirot asked, scanning the windows. "Adam Fosbury, only son of Lord Gilbert Fosbury, died last night, his 28th birthday." Cray lowered his voice as they approached the house. "He was found in the studio, locked from the inside, no sign of violence, but—" He paused. "His face, it's twisted, not with pain exactly, more like fear. And something else." Poirot did not respond. He merely nodded and followed Cray up the gravel path. The statues watched them pass, eternally frozen mid-pirouette. Inside, the estate was everything the exterior promised. Modern, curated, unsettling. Wide spaces, marble floors, jazz-era murals. The air was perfumed faintly with lilies and turpentine. They were led by a stiff butler named Riddle down a corridor to the studio, a large high-ceilinged room with velvet drapes, parquet floors, and the faint smell of linseed oil. On one wall hung a striking mural, the same 4 young men in velvet, only this time in motion, their limbs blurred into abstraction. At the center of the room was a chaise lounge, and there lay the body of Adam Fosbury. Poirot stepped forward, his shoes making the faintest sigh against the floor. The young man was handsome, even in death. Dark curls, high cheekbones. He wore an open-collared shirt and velvet jacket, a soft, deep blue. His eyes were still open, wide and staring, and his lips parted slightly, as though gasping at something just beyond comprehension. Poirot bent closer. "Mon cher Cray," he murmured. "His pupils are dilated." He was afraid, yes, but also surprised. "This is not a man who saw death coming." Cray nodded grimly. There was no forced entry. The room was locked. No signs of poison in the brandy. though we're waiting on final toxicology, but Lord Fosbury swears his son had no enemies." "Everyone has enemies," Poirot said, rising and smoothing his cuffs. "Sometimes they wear velvet." He walked to the mural, studying the brushstrokes. "You see, Inspector, the young men in this painting are not dancing, not truly. Look at their hands. Not joy, but struggle. And look, here, one of them is pulling back." Cray stepped closer. "I hadn't noticed that." Poirot turned, his eyes sharp now. "Tell me, who was present last night?" Cray handed him a slim notebook. 6 guests, all in the house at the time. All friends or acquaintances of the deceased. They dined together. After midnight, Adam retired to paint. By morning he was found dead. Poirot flipped through the names, each one written in Cray's tidy hand: Gideon Vale, sculptor; old schoolmate Madeleine Fosbury; Adam's cousin Henry Arledge; theatre director Sylvie Lemaire; French model, staying for the season Simon Quill, art critic and columnist; Verena Moore, housekeeper. Long-time employee. Poirot's gaze lingered on the list. 6 suspects, he said softly, and a locked room. Then, suddenly, he smiled. "Bon. Let us begin, Inspector. The affair at Young Men in Velvet. It promises to be most choreographed." And with that, he turned toward the hallway, where secrets waited in the walls like music behind curtains. Poirot moved with quiet precision through the corridor, his eyes flicking discreetly across the art-lined walls as Cray led him back toward the drawing room where the remaining guests had gathered. There was no rush in his step, only the deliberate pace of a man accustomed to letting silence speak before questions began. Every detail, every vase, every faint scuff on the polished floor was noted. Poirot missed nothing. They entered the drawing room, a space of elegant discomfort. The air was thick not just with grief, but with unease, the strained civility of people trying to behave as though a man had not died violently just down the hall. 6 faces turned toward them. 5 guests and 1 housekeeper, each person carefully composed, and yet not one of them appeared entirely at ease. That, Poirot thought, was natural. What was unnatural would be calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cray began, clearing his throat, "may I present Monsieur Hercule Poirot, who has kindly come down from London to assist with the investigation." There was a slight stir, recognition from some, discomfort from others. Poirot offered a small bow, fingers resting gently atop his walking stick, though he had no need of it. "Mes amis," he said, "permit me to offer my condolences. I am sorry that our acquaintance must begin under such melancholy circumstances. I understand you were all present at the estate last night when Monsieur Adam Fosbury died." "Died?" said the young woman seated by the fireplace, Sylvie Lemaire, the French model. Her voice was smoky, touched by the barest tremor. "But you mean murdered, no?" Poirot inclined his head ever so slightly. "That, mademoiselle, is what I am here to determine." There was a moment of silence, broken only by the soft ticking of a minimalist wall clock. Poirot moved to the center of the room and regarded them each in turn, as though examining a tableau rather than living persons. The sculptor, Gideon Vale, lounged in an overstuffed chair, legs crossed, hands restless. He wore a dark shirt stained with plaster dust and regarded Poirot with the wary air of a man accustomed to being misunderstood. Madeleine Fosbury sat beside him, statuesque and composed, her pale hands folded in her lap. Her face bore the signature poise of old money, unmoved but not unmoved. To the right, Simon Quill, the critic, stood near the sideboard, a drink untouched in his hand. He wore spectacles with gold rims and carried the soft arrogance of someone who believed themselves just slightly superior to the room. Near him stood Henry Arledge, the theatre director, tall, lean, with a shock of white hair and eyes that moved like stage lights, always scanning, always observing. The final member of the group, Verena Moore, lingered at the edge of the room like a shadow in plain sight. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture deferential, but her eyes, dark, heavy-lidded, watched everything. "Please," Poirot said gently, "do not allow my presence to disturb you. I have only some simple questions to ask, to understand the movements of last night." Gideon Vale gave a short, humorless laugh. "Movements? What is this, a ballet? Non, monsieur. Merely a dance of truth. Poirot turned to Inspector Cray. Would you be so kind as to bring me the schedule of last night's dinner, whom the young man spoke with, when each person retired, any moments of note? Cray nodded and stepped out. Poirot turned his attention first to Madeleine. Mademoiselle Fosbury, you were cousin to the deceased, yes? She inclined her head. Our mothers were sisters. Adam and I were raised together, though I lived in Paris for most of the past decade. I returned only recently. Poirot studied her face for a moment. And last night, did you speak much with him? She hesitated. Somewhat. We shared a bottle of wine before dinner in the garden. He seemed thoughtful, distant. But Adam was always dramatic. He fancied himself the tortured artist. Poirot nodded but said nothing. He moved next to Henry Arledge. You are in the theatre, monsieur. I direct, Arledge said crisply. And yes, I knew Adam through Gideon. He did some portrait work for one of my productions in Bristol. We became acquainted. Poirot's gaze held him. And did you find him, how shall we say, stable of temperament? Arledge shrugged. Creative people rarely are. Adam could be charming, but he lived in a world of his own making. Poirot turned slightly. Monsieur Quill, you are a writer, I believe. A critic, Quill said, his voice clipped. For The Observer. I write a cultural column, art, architecture, the occasional book. Adam invited me to stay this weekend to see a new piece he'd been working on. A painting, I believe. Poirot smiled faintly. So it was not merely a social visit? Quill bristled. It was both. I've known Adam for 5 years. I introduced him to several galleries. We weren't close friends, but we were allies, I suppose. In the art world, that matters more. Poirot turned to Sylvie. She looked directly at him, her eyes a shade too open. And you, mademoiselle? She drew herself up slightly. I met Adam in Monaco this summer. He was visiting a collector. We spent some weeks together. He asked me to come to Dartmoor for his birthday. Poirot tilted his head. Was there affection between you? She gave a soft, bitter laugh. From him? From me? I don't know. Adam was intense. He wanted everything to be symbolic. Every gesture had to mean something. She looked away. Even love. Merci, Poirot said, and then turned to Verena Moore, who had been standing silently all this while. You were the housekeeper for how many years? 16, she said quietly. Her voice was low, dry. I was in service to the late Lady Fosbury before she passed. Lord Gilbert kept me on. And last night, I laid the dinner table, ensured the kitchen was in order. I do not join. The guests. Afterward, I retired to the cottage out back, next to the gardener's shed. I was in bed by 10:30. Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. Forgive me, mademoiselle, but who else would have had access to the studio? Verena looked him in the eye. Anyone who knew Adam. He didn't believe in locks until it was too late. He only locked the studio when he wanted to brood. Poirot tapped his chin thoughtfully. Just then, Cray re-entered, carrying a handwritten schedule. We've pieced this together from guest accounts, he said, handing it to Poirot. Poirot read, Date at p.m., dinner served in the main hall, 9:30 p.m., drinks in the salon. 10:15 p.m., guests retire to their rooms or gardens, 11:00 p.m. Adam returns to the studio alone. Morning, 7:30 a.m., housekeeper attempts. To bring breakfast, finds door locked from inside, 8:10 a.m. Cray called Poirot, read it once, then again slowly. He tapped the edge of the page. You say the door was locked from within? Yes, Cray confirmed. We had to force it. No windows open, no sign of tampering, which makes it all the more baffling. Poirot looked back at the mural in his mind, the blur of motion, the hidden gesture. There is no such thing as a baffling crime, he murmured. Only baffled minds. He glanced once more around the room. 5 guests, 1 servant, 6 lives woven tightly around a man now lying, still in velvet. He smiled gently to himself. Come, Inspector, let us walk the grounds. I find fresh air is most conducive to fresh thoughts. He did not say it, but the thoughts had already begun to form, silent, precise, orderly. The dance was beginning. and someone in the room had led the last step. As they stepped into the cold afternoon light, Poirot pulled his coat tighter around him. The wind that swept across the Dartmoor estate was sharp and restless, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and fading leaves. The sky had darkened slightly, clouds dragging themselves across the horizon in slow procession. Inspector Cray walked beside him, silent at first. Poirot, as ever, preferred to observe before questioning. The estate's layout unfolded before them. The house to their rear, the lawn sloping down toward a clipped hedge maze, the gardener's shed tucked near a bend in the path, and beyond that, the modest stone cottage where Verena Moore lived. In the other direction stood the garage and a modest stable block. Unused now, but once home to the Fosburys' hunting ponies. The air felt heavy, as though the land itself held its breath. She said she retired at 10:30, Poirot said, softly, nodding toward the cottage. And no one heard anything? No footsteps, no argument? Cray shook his head. Not according to her. And the other guests were all either in their rooms or in the gardens. We've only their word, of course. No witnesses. Poirot stopped, his gaze landing on one of the bronze statues, one of the young men in velvet. The figure was poised in a half-turn, fingers spread in a delicate arc as though about to pirouette. But his face, now that Poirot studied it, was not joyful. It was contorted, not quite in pain, but in intensity. Passion, perhaps. Or fear. You see, mon ami, Poirot murmured, even art betrays its secrets eventually. Cray followed his gaze. Odd thing, isn't it? That statue. Adam modelled them after his friends, you know, supposedly. Indeed, Poirot said, interest quickening. Which friends? Cray pointed toward the one in question. That's supposed to be Henry Arledge, or so Adam claimed. The others are less obvious. He never confirmed them. One's probably Gideon. Another might even be himself. Poirot studied the bronze figure once more. The performance of identity, he murmured. To sculpt someone in motion is an act of intimacy. One must see not only their form, but their intention. To capture them, one must understand them. He continued walking, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. Tell me, Inspector, this painting Adam was working on before his death, has it been found? Cray nodded. Yes. On the easel in the studio, nearly finished. A strange piece. I didn't want to disturb it before you arrived. Then let us return there shortly. But first, one more thing. He gestured toward the side path that led to the gardens, where Madeline claimed she and Adam had shared wine the night before. I wish to see the place where Mademoiselle Fosbury and her cousin spoke. There is something odd in her demeanour. They walked the path, passing a trellis woven with browning vines until they reached the rear garden, a secluded alcove enclosed on three sides by high hedges. A wrought-iron table sat under a pergola, vines curling through the lattice above it. A half-empty wine bottle still stood on the table, forgotten, along with two crystal glasses. Poirot bent and examined the lip of one glass. Lipstick. The other bore a faint residue, a chalky pink stain clinging to the rim. Do you notice, Mon? Tell Poirot said, how this wine glass has a peculiar ring. Cray leaned in. Something mixed into it? Possibly. A powdered tablet, perhaps, crushed sedative or medication. We shall have it tested. He straightened. Or it may be nothing at all. But everything is something until it is proven otherwise. They made their way back into the house where the studio awaited them. Poirot paused at the threshold before stepping in, taking in the scene anew. The chaise lounge still stood where the body had been found, though now draped with a sheet. The studio smelled faintly of oil wood polish and the ghost of turpentine. A tall easel dominated the center of the room, holding the unfinished painting. Poirot approached slowly, his eyes narrowing. The painting was beautiful, surreal, and disturbing. It showed the same four dancers, the young men in velvet, but this time their faces were melting into one another. One figure had Henry Arledge's angular profile, another bore the broad shoulders of Gideon Vale. But it was the background that intrigued Poirot most. Behind them loomed a fifth figure, only half formed in the paint. It was dark, faceless, a shadow at the edge of the composition. Cray stepped beside him. No one remembers him painting that last figure. Poirot's eyes did not leave the canvas. Because they were not meant to see it. He added it in solitude, perhaps late last night. He turned his head. What if, Inspector, this painting is not merely a performance, but a confession? Cray frowned. A confession to what? Poirot's voice was soft. To the knowledge of betrayal, or fear, or guilt. There is always a moment before the end when the artist tells his truth. He turned abruptly. Fetch me Gideon Vale, I wish to speak with him alone. Minutes later the sculptor entered, his face guarded. He stood with his hands in his pockets, a slight sneer curling his lip as he regarded Poirot. You summoned me, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot smiled mildly. Indeed, I have been admiring your bronze statues. Beautiful work. Gideon raised an eyebrow. Thank you. Though I doubt you brought me here to flatter my art. Poirot gestured toward the painting. This canvas, were you aware Adam was working on it? Vaguely. He always had something on the go. His process was chaotic, you see. Liked to surprise everyone, including himself. Yet the subjects appear familiar to you, no? Gideon shrugged. We all modeled for him at one point or another. It was part of the scene. He painted us, sculpted us, made us grotesque or beautiful or both. Poirot stepped forward slightly. Did he ever paint something that troubled you, monsieur? A version of you that felt too revealing? Gideon stiffened. He had a way of seeing through people that could be uncomfortable. Did you argue recently? The sculptor hesitated. Not really. We had our moments. He accused me of stealing a gallery contact, ridiculous of course, he liked to dramatize. And yet, Poirot said softly, you stayed for his birthday. Gideon gave a bitter smile. Of course. That was Adam. You could hate him on Tuesday and toast him on Thursday. He made enemies the way most. People made conversation. Poirot was silent for a moment, then dismissed him with a courteous nod. When the door closed, he spoke without turning. Call for Sylvie Lemaire next. She entered delicately, her perfume preceding her by half a breath. Her lips were set in a careful smile, but her eyes were wary. You found something. She said, not a question. Perhaps, Poirot replied. Tell me, mademoiselle, did Adam speak of any threats, any fears? She shook her head slowly. He was unsettled. He thought someone was copying his work. He said he found sketches, his own style, but not his hand. He joked it was his shadow self. I thought it was just nonsense. Poirot nodded. And did he ever confide in you? About the others? About Gideon? She gave a slight shrug. He had complicated feelings about Gideon, admiration mixed with resentment. He once said Gideon sculpted in stone what he painted in spirit. I didn't understand it. Poirot watched her carefully. Did you love him? Her eyes narrowed slightly. Love is a word Adam used too easily. Me? I was fond of him. But love? No. Not in the way he wanted. Poirot offered a gentle nod of thanks and dismissed her. When he was alone again, he moved to the window, watching the grey light filter through the trees. The case, like the painting, was becoming clearer by shadow. Each suspect had something to hide, but one detail lingered. In his mind, the faceless figure in the painting, not a subject. A presence, not art. A message. And Poirot, more than anyone, understood how truth was often hidden, not in what one said, but in what one dared to depict. As evening began to fall across the Dartmoor estate, Poirot remained by the window of the studio, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed not on the garden beyond but on the reflection of the painting behind him. The canvas continued to haunt him. That faceless figure, half painted, half hidden, was not merely an artistic choice. It was, Poirot was increasingly convinced, a cipher, and like all ciphers, it could be solved. The door opened gently, and Inspector Cray stepped inside, a folder in hand. Toxicology came in faster than expected, he said, offering the report. Nothing in the brandy glass that killed him. No sedatives, no toxins. But the wine glass from the garden? Trace amounts of chloral hydrate. Poirot nodded slowly. A sedative. Strong enough to dull the senses. If Adam consumed that before, retiring to the studio, he might have been disoriented, Cray finished. Slow to react, vulnerable. Precisely, said Poirot, but it does not explain how he died. The heart gave out, yes? But in a young man fit, healthy, it should not have, unless he was already under extraordinary emotional duress. Cray lowered his voice. We're having the body re-examined, looking for signs of induced heart failure, certain alkaloids or compounds that don't always show on standard panels. But the room was locked. We keep coming back to that. Poirot made a small sound, almost a hum. Let us not be deceived by the romanticism of a locked room, mon ami. The world is full of keys, and the clever criminal does not always lock from within. They merely wish it to appear so. He turned fully now, brushing a speck from his sleeve. There is a deception here, but it is not of locks and windows. It is of psychology. He walked across the studio and gestured toward the canvas. This figure, the shadow, do you not find it peculiar that no one has identified who it represents? Cray looked again. It's indistinct. Could be any of them. Could even be symbolic. Poirot's brows lifted. Ah, but symbols are chosen for a reason. Adam was a man obsessed with significance. Every gesture, every hue. He layered meaning like lacquer. This was not random. He stepped closer to the painting. I believe he knew who would kill him, or at least who might try. And this was his final act of expression. Cray frowned. So what now? Now, Poirot said, straightening his tie, we speak with Henry Arledge. They found the theatre director seated in the reading room, an open volume of Racine on his lap and a glass of port at his side. He looked up as they entered, composed but wary. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, he said, I wondered when you'd get to me. Gideon mentioned you were asking about the painting. Poirot nodded, taking the seat opposite him. Indeed, it is a remarkable composition. Did you model for it? Arledge gave a tight smile. In part. Years ago, Adam reused old sketches and photographs. He was a magpie. He collected moments. You had a close association then? Arledge leaned back. I admired him. He had raw talent, though he lacked discipline. We had tensions, creative differences. He was, shall we say, too fond of the melodrama. Did you see him the night he died? Only briefly after dinner. I went out for air and then retired. Early. Poirot tilted his head. You have a theatre company, I believe. I do Bristol's Ashlight Company. We do both contemporary and classical work. Adam had designs to stage one of his more abstract works with us, a collaboration that never fully materialized. Poirot watched him carefully. You are a man of structure, precision. Your profession demands it. Indeed, Arledge replied, adjusting his cufflinks. The theatre is about illusion, yes, but it is also about control. Timing, blocking, even the chaos is rehearsed. Poirot rose slowly. And so is murder, monsieur. Arledge's smile didn't quite fade, but it no longer reached his eyes. Are you accusing me? Non, I am merely observing. But I must ask, did Adam ever threaten to reveal something? Something personal? Something embarrassing? There was a pause, a flicker in Arledge's expression, subtle and brief. He was a provocateur, he said finally. He liked to imply he knew more than he did. Secrets, affairs of the mind. But I never gave him anything he could weaponize. Poirot bowed slightly. Merci, monsieur. That will be all, for now. Back in the hallway, Cray exhaled. Do you believe him? Poirot's reply was mild. He believes himself, which is not always the same. They returned to the drawing room, where Simon Quill was now seated alone, scribbling notes into a small leather-bound journal. He looked up with annoyance. I assume you're here to ask whether I killed my friend, he said. Poirot smiled, thinly. You anticipated correctly. Quill closed the book with a snap. I didn't, but I suspect someone here did. That woman, Madeline, she had a strange hold over Adam. And Sylvie, she's been playing games with all of them. You sound certain, Poirot said. Yet you stayed, Quill smirked. Writers stay for the ending, even when they sense it won't be happy. Poirot's gaze sharpened. What was your stake, monsieur? You knew Adam, you supported him, but you also profited from proximity. Quill looked away. He gave me access, the world of artists, galleries, men like Gideon and Henry. They talk only to insiders. I became one. And if Adam withdrew that access? He threatened it once, Quill said quietly. After I published a less-than-glowing column, called me a parasite, but he cooled off, he always did. Until he didn't. They left Quill behind and moved toward the stairs. The house had grown darker, the edges of the corridors shadowed, the warmth of day fading fast. Poirot paused at the base of the staircase. I must speak to Madeleine again. Something is not right in her account, and I suspect she knows it. Upstairs, her room was at the far end of the hall, overlooking the gardens. She answered the knock in her robe, hair tied back, eyes wary. I won't lie to you, Monsieur Poirot, she said before he could speak. I don't sleep easily. Nor do the innocent, mademoiselle, Poirot said gently. But I am here only to ask one question. Why did you lie about the wine? She stiffened. I didn't. There was a sedative in Adam's glass. Poirot said calmly. Not yours. You knew it. You left it there. She was silent for a long moment, then stepped back to let him in. The room was tastefully sparse. Cool greys, bookshelves, a writing desk. I didn't poison him, she said finally. But yes, I gave him something to calm his nerves. He asked for it. We argued earlier in the day. About money, about family. Things, and he was spiraling. I had old sedatives from my time in Paris. I slipped one into his glass before we sat in the garden. He drank it. He knew. He just didn't want to talk about it. Poirot studied her. So, why not say so? She hesitated. Because I knew how it would look, and because I wasn't sure it was just a sedative. The bottle was unmarked. It had been years. I panicked. You should not lie to the truth, mademoiselle, Poirot said. It grows impatient. She dropped into the chair near the fireplace, her fingers clenching the robe's belt. I loved him, you know. Not romantically, but deeply. We were alike, both born into lives we didn't choose, both trying to make sense of them. Poirot bowed, his head slightly, and left her there, returning once more to the studio. This time he noticed something new. A faint smear near the painting's base, something dry and reddish. Not paint. Dried blood? No. Poirot leaned in. Wax. Burgundy sealing wax, rubbed flat. He stepped back and looked again. Not just a painting, but a message, or better still, a warning. Beneath the faceless figure scratched faintly into the corner, he now saw the outline of a letter, or part of one, a name perhaps. Poirot smiled to himself. The truth was surfacing, and now it only needed to be invited to speak. Poirot stood motionless, in the dimly lit studio, his gaze lingering on the faint smear of sealing wax and the nearly invisible etching beneath the painting's lower edge. The wax had been applied hastily, not with decorative flourish, but almost in panic. That in itself told him much. He reached into his breast pocket, withdrew a monogrammed handkerchief, and gently dabbed at the faint marking. The light caught. It at an angle, just enough to reveal a curved stroke, the tail end of a capital letter. Perhaps a Q, perhaps a stylized G. He made no attempt to touch the rest. It was not yet time. The painting, like the crime itself, was an unfinished sentence. To rush to the period before the clause was complete would be most unwise. Outside, the wind was rising. A storm was coming. Poirot sensed it not only in the branches tapping the studio window, but in the emotional undercurrents of the house. Tension had been mounting, and soon it would reach its breaking point. He left the room without a word and found Inspector Cray in the hallway, conferring quietly with a constable. Mon ami, Poirot said, I require two things. First, bring me Verena Moore, the housekeeper. And second, I wish to see the tools and supplies Adam kept for his painting. His pigments, brushes, wax, sealing sticks, everything. Cray gave a brisk nod and set off. Poirot returned briefly to the drawing room and poured himself a small glass of water from the sideboard. He took a seat, setting the glass down without drinking. He allowed the silence to stretch, listening, always. Listening to the house itself. It had a voice, though few bothered to hear it. Footsteps approached. Verena entered, hands clasped in front of her. Her posture was impeccable, but her expression had changed since their first conversation. There was something taut in her face now. Not fear, something older. Weariness. Madame Moore, Poirot said gently, you have served this house a long time. You knew Adam Fosbury from childhood. She nodded once. Since he was 5. You remained even after Lady Fosbury's passing, even after the family fortune began to fracture. That speaks to loyalty. Her eyes met his. It speaks to debt. Ah, Poirot said softly. Not monetary. No, a different kind. The kind you never quite pay off. He allowed a moment of quiet. You were in your cottage the night Adam died. But before that, did you observe anything? Something out of place? A light on when it should have been off? Footsteps where none should be? Verena hesitated. I saw Miss Lemaire walking the corridor late. Past 11, I'd say. She was barefoot, going toward the studio. Poirot raised an eyebrow. She did not mention that. No, Verena replied. I imagine she wouldn't. Poirot stood and walked slowly to the fireplace, staring into the cold grate. You see, Madame Moore, there is something in this house that everyone is circling, but no one dares to name. A shadow, a presence. Adam tried to paint it, and now, I believe he died for it. Verena said nothing, but her eyes flickered, just once. Poirot turned. You knew he was afraid, didn't you? A long pause. Yes, she said, but he didn't know why. That was the part that terrified him. He'd lost the ability to separate performance from reality. Poirot nodded slowly. Merci, madame. As she left, Cray returned with a wooden box. Inside it were pigments, oils, tubes of paint, bits of rag, and yes, 3 sticks of sealing wax, burgundy, deep green, and black. One of the sticks was broken, its tip crusted as if melted over a flame. There's our match, Cray said. Do we test it? Poirot shook his head. Later. For now, let us allow the murderer to come to us. He glanced toward the stairs. Sylvie Lemaire, she must be spoken to again, immediately. Cray raised a brow, but complied. In a few minutes, Sylvie entered, wrapped in a silk shawl, her hair loosely pinned. She looked more vulnerable now, and less polished. The fatigue was starting to show. Poirot did not rise to greet her. He remained seated, fingers steepled before him. Mademoiselle, he said, you were seen in the hallway late last night, walking toward the studio. Sylvie's eyes widened, but only slightly. She recovered quickly. Yes, I did go. I couldn't sleep. I thought I might speak with him. But when I got near, the door was closed and I heard him talking, so I turned back. Poirot's voice was quiet. You heard him speaking to whom? I don't know, she said. It sounded like Gideon, or maybe Henry. I wasn't sure. But you did not mention this before? No, she said, because I wasn't supposed to be out of my room. I didn't want to become a suspect. Poirot's expression did not change. And yet you are one. Sylvie paled. I didn't kill him. No, Poirot agreed. But you may know who did. Mademoiselle, I beg of you, think carefully. What exactly did you hear? Sylvie hesitated. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I heard Adam say no more lies, then a pause, then I should never have trusted you. Poirot nodded slowly. Merci. He stood and walked to the door. We are almost at the end, he said over his shoulder. Back in the studio once more, Poirot stood before the painting for the 3rd time that day. He lifted a small brush from the art box and dipped it in a bit of turpentine. Gently, carefully, he brushed over the dried wax mark. It flaked slightly, revealing more of the etched letter beneath. A full name began to emerge. Quill, not scratched by the artist in passion. Etched deliberately. A signature, no, a clue. Poirot stepped back, heart calm, mind alight. Simon Quill, he said softly, you have overplayed your hand. The critic had always been careful to position himself on the periphery, useful, observant, present, but never involved. And yet he was everywhere, the guest who knew everyone, the man who needed Adam for access, for content, for reputation. And perhaps, Poirot thought, the man who feared being exposed. Because what if Adam had painted something, seen something, written something Quill could not allow to reach the world? Poirot rang the bell and summoned Cray. Tomorrow morning, he said, you will gather everyone in the drawing room. We shall bring this performance to its final act. Cray frowned. You've solved it. Poirot smiled just slightly. I have watched the dance, I have read the canvas, and now it is time to unmask the dancer. The next morning broke grey and still, as though the moors themselves had paused to listen. A chill had settled over. The estate, and a low mist drifted across the lawns, curling around the bronze statues like a shroud. Inside the house, the air was heavier than usual, thick with the knowledge that something was about to happen. Every footstep echoed just a little too loudly. Every door closed with just a little too much care. The guests were awake early, dressed with a formality none had shown since their arrival, each of them quietly pulled by the gravity of the moment that awaited. At precisely 9 o'clock, Poirot entered the drawing room. He was immaculate as ever, dark suit pressed to perfection, shoes gleaming, the knot of his tie as symmetrical as a mirror. He carried nothing but a small, silver-handled cane, though he used it only as a prop, not out of necessity. Inspector Cray stood by the fireplace, arms folded, watching the room with practiced eyes. Poirot waited until all were seated. Madeleine Fosbury sat upright, her expression composed but brittle, as though too much pressure might fracture it. Gideon Vale leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, fingers drumming softly on his sleeve. Sylvie Lemaire clutched her shawl tightly, her eyes wary and shadowed. Henry Arledge's face was unreadable, a director watching the final scene of a tragedy, not of his own staging. Verena Moore stood by the wall, still and silent, as if she herself had become part of the wallpaper. And then there was Simon Quill, legs crossed neatly, a pen tucked behind one ear, and that small, cultivated smile he wore like armor. His gaze flicked to Poirot, then away. Poirot moved to the center of the room. "Mes amis," he began, his voice calm and warm. "You have been patient. You have answered questions, tolerated suspicion, and waited, perhaps with unease, for clarity. Now that clarity arrives." He walked slowly, deliberately, between the chairs, speaking as though weaving a thread through each of them. Adam Fosbury did not die by accident, nor by illness. He died because of fear and betrayal, but let us begin not with the moment of his death, but with the days before. He turned. You see, Adam was not merely an artist. He was a man who lived in symbols. He painted people as they were, but more than that, as he saw them becoming. He captured not the moment, but the undercurrent. He saw the lie beneath the compliment, the envy behind the embrace. He stopped before the fireplace. And recently he began to see something else, something darker. He felt a presence among his circle, an echo he could not explain. Paintings were touched when his back was turned. Sketches appeared that mimicked his hand but not his soul. He began to suspect someone was stealing from him, not only his style but his very identity. Poirot turned to Sylvie. "You spoke of this, mademoiselle. You called it his shadow self," a poetic phrase. But he feared it was more than metaphor. He shifted to face the group fully. And then came the birthday, the gathering, the dancers, again, reunited, the young men in velvet, though now one was a woman and one a writer, and none of them quite the same as before. His voice softened. Adam painted one last time, a painting unfinished, yet more truthful than any before. 4 dancers, faces, distorted, identities blurred, and behind them a 5th figure, faceless, ominous, watching. Poirot walked to the sideboard, retrieved a small envelope from his pocket, and held it up. Behind the canvas, sealed in wax, was this. A fragment of paper with one word scratched upon it, Quill. All eyes turned to Simon. He did not move. His fingers tightened slightly around the arm of his chair, but the smile remained. Poirot's voice grew firmer. Adam knew. He had begun to suspect that someone was manipulating him, reworking his art, intercepting his contacts, reshaping his reputation. But what he had not expected was how deep the betrayal would go. He looked directly at Simon now. You, monsieur, were his ally, his advocate, but also his parasite. When his work gained notice, your columns followed. When his exhibitions sold well, your access grew. You rode the coattails of his fame until it began to falter, and then, quietly, you began preparing the shift. Poirot moved closer. You published critiques of similar work under new names. You introduced emerging artists whose techniques bore uncanny resemblance to Adam's because you had stolen them. You were reshaping his voice into your own narrative, but Adam caught on. Simon's expression didn't waver. You're making quite a story, Poirot. No, Poirot said quietly. I am revealing one. He nodded to Cray, who stepped forward and set a small canvas on the table. It was unsigned but unmistakably in Adam's style, except not quite. The brushwork was subtly different, less sure, more mechanical. The subject, a dancer in profile, almost identical to the one on Adam's mural. This was submitted anonymously to the Prescott Gallery 3 weeks ago, Cray said. Claimed to be a rediscovered Adam Fosbury work. But the forensic analysis shows different pigment composition, and under UV light, faint penciled guidelines that Adam never used. Cray stepped back. Poirot resumed. Adam had begun collecting evidence. He knew someone was using his legacy against him, and in that final painting he tried to reveal it. But someone, you, Monsieur Quill, panicked. Poirot's voice dropped. You slipped into the studio late that night under the pretense of checking on him. Perhaps you thought he was asleep, drugged from the sedative placed in his wine. You confronted him. He accused you. Perhaps he threatened to expose you. Poirot walked slowly behind Simon now, his voice silk wrapped around steel. And that was when you struck, not with violence, no, but with fear. You used what you knew of his heart condition, his anxiety, his sensitivity to stress. You provoked him, knowing it would be enough. Poirot paused. The room was deathly still. You said the right words. You watched his breath stutter, his hand clutch at his chest. You stepped back and waited. Poirot turned, face now filled with solemn finality. And then you locked the door behind you. Simon rose slowly. His smile faded, but not gone. You have no proof, he said. Only stories and shadows. Poirot gave a small shrug. You are correct. The law may struggle to convict you. But the truth, it has already passed judgment. Silence followed. Then Madeleine stood. Is it true? She asked, voice trembling. Simon looked at her, and for the first time something cracked in his composure. It was always going to end this way, he said. Adam made everything into theatre. He wouldn't let go. He wanted to paint forever, and to never let anyone else step forward. Poirot stepped aside. Cray moved in quietly and placed a hand on Simon's shoulder. Until further notice, Mr. Quill, you will remain under supervision. Simon did not resist. Poirot turned away, his gaze falling once more on the painting, where the faceless figure loomed behind the dancers, no longer a mystery, but a mirror. Truth, at last, had claimed its shape. Cray led Simon Quill out of the drawing room in silence, the constable following close behind. No one else spoke. The room remained frozen in the moment that had just passed, as though each guest were afraid to exhale and break the delicate stillness. Poirot, standing now once more in front of the cold fireplace, made no theatrical exit. Instead, he quietly turned and resumed his seat, folding his hands on his lap as the echoes of judgment settled into the floorboards. It was Madeleine who finally stirred, her voice low. So it was Simon, all along. Poirot's gaze shifted to her, not sharply, not accusingly, but with the soft precision of a mind still weighing everything. Simon was the instrument, he said, but not the composer. Her brow furrowed. What do you mean? Poirot leaned forward slightly. You all presumed Adam died because of a confrontation, because someone entered the studio. But what if the mechanism of his death had been set in motion before that moment? What if what happened in that room was merely the final crack in a structure already compromised? He looked at each of them. In turn, Sylvie, Gideon, Henry, Madeleine, Verena. Consider, mes amis, that a man does not collapse from a single blow to the soul. He collapses when the weight of many blows, delivered quietly and over time, becomes too great. That is what we saw with Adam. Sylvie's voice was soft. Then it wasn't murder? Oh, but it was, Poirot said, only not in the way you think. And Simon Quill was not the only one who wielded the blade. Henry Arledge shifted uncomfortably in his chair. If you're suggesting we're all to blame, Poirot, I think that's a rather convenient philosophy. You can't arrest people for being unpleasant. No, Poirot agreed. But you can examine the shape of guilt. Monsieur Quill exploited Adam. But you... He looked. At Henry now, you humiliated him. Henry frowned. I did no such thing. Oh, but you did, Poirot said. You dangled the promise of a stage collaboration, then withdrew it at the last moment. You told others in private that Adam's work lacked vision, that it was posturing without purpose. Adam heard of this. He kept the letter you sent him, cancelling your commission, in the drawer of his desk. It had food stains on it, indicating you never intended it seriously. That stung. Poirot turned to Gideon next. And you, Monsieur Vale, pretended to support him while feeding his ideas to competitors. The sculpture that debuted in Berlin, the one you claimed was your own conception, bore uncanny resemblance to a sketch Adam had shown you 3 years ago. A sketch only you had seen, and yet you submitted it as your own. Gideon's mouth opened, but no words emerged. He lowered his gaze. Poirot's voice remained calm. Mademoiselle Fosbury, you were perhaps the kindest to Adam. But even you lied, not merely about the sedative, but about what he confessed to you the night before he died. Madeleine's lips parted. I didn't. He told you he was afraid someone would ruin his work, undo everything he'd built, Poirot continued. And you told him he was being paranoid, that he needed rest, that the shadows he saw were only in his mind. He paused. You believed you were helping, but you dismissed the warning signs, the signals of a man unraveling. That dismissal, well-intentioned though it may have been, helped push him further into isolation. Madeleine said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, though she tried to hide them beneath the fabric of her dress. Poirot looked at Sylvie. And you, mademoiselle, knew he loved you. But you were cruel, in the way that only the admired can be cruel to the admirer. You made him feel seen, and then you looked away. You flirted with Gideon, shared private jests with Henry. You were not malicious, but you were careless. And to a man like Adam, so intensely aware of every gesture, it was 1,000 small cuts. Sylvie's eyes filled, but she did not cry. Poirot turned last to Verena. You saw everything. The shifting loyalties, the backhanded compliments, the slow erosion of Adam's confidence, and yet you remained silent. You told yourself it wasn't your place, that it was none of your business. But silence is rarely innocent. Verena's voice was a whisper. What could I have done? You could have said, I see what they're doing to you. You could have named it aloud. That sometimes is enough. A long silence settled in the room. Not defensive this time, reflective. Poirot stood. The human heart, mes amis, is not a fortress. It is a theatre. And when enough of the cast begins to betray the play, the performance collapses. He moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain slightly. The fog outside was beginning to lift, revealing the bronze statues once more. The dancers, forever caught in motion. He looked at them as if greeting old ghosts. Adam was not weak, Poirot said almost to himself. He was sensitive. And sensitivity is not weakness. It is strength in a world that too often forgets how to feel. He turned back to the room. Simon Quill will answer to the law. The rest of you, well, the law cannot touch what you did. But your conscience, that is another matter. He took up his cane. I leave you now, not in judgment, but in truth. The affair at Young Men in Velvet is ended. But its echoes, those, I fear, will remain. No one followed him to the door. No one spoke. The house had fallen into a silence more complete than any Poirot had felt since arriving. It was the silence that followed understanding, the kind that leaves space for remorse. As he stepped outside, the mist parted fully. The wind had died. The morning was still and clear. Poirot walked slowly down the path, passing once more the bronze dancers. This time he paused. He looked up at the nearest figure, the one they claimed was modelled after Henry Arledge. The expression was no longer ambiguous to Poirot. He saw it clearly now. It was not dance. It was recoil, an attempt to escape something, unseen. Behind the figure, faint but unmistakable, was the positioning of another's hand, one not sculpted but implied, a presence not captured but haunting. Yes, Poirot thought, Adam had known. He tipped his hat ever so slightly to the silent dancers and continued down the gravel path toward the waiting car. Justice, in the end, had not been loud. It had simply been seen. The car rolled gently down the winding drive, the morning mist receding behind it like a curtain lowering on a final act. Poirot sat in perfect silence in the rear seat, his hands folded neatly atop his cane, his expression unreadable. To anyone else, he might have seemed at rest. But within his mind, the little grey cells were still hard at work. Not with the solving of the case, but with its meaning. There was always a meaning. Not every crime was born of greed or jealousy or rage. Some, like this one, were born of erosion, of quiet betrayals, slow abandonments, and art twisted into currency. It was the tragedy of ego disguised as admiration, of competition pretending to be companionship. Adam Fosbury's death had not come with the bang of a pistol, but with the soft, invisible hush of disillusionment. Half an hour later, Poirot arrived at the modest Devonshire railway station, where a train waited to carry him back to London. As he stepped onto the platform, a light rain began to fall, nothing more than a fine mist, but enough to bead against the brim of his hat. He walked, slowly, not from fatigue but from reflection. His suitcase had been sent ahead, and he carried only his cane and a small leather-bound notebook tucked beneath one arm. On the train, he took a private compartment and sat alone, gazing out at the passing countryside as it blurred into a watercolor of hedgerows and stone walls. Occasionally he jotted down a note or two in his book, not about suspects or timelines or clues. That part of the case was finished, but there were always human details to record, feelings, impressions, insights into character. Poirot was not a man who took satisfaction in the ruin of others. It gave him no pleasure to expose a killer, though. He did it with clarity and conviction. The pleasure came not from the defeat of guilt, but from the defense of truth. And truth, in this case, had taken a strange and winding road. He thought again of the painting, the dancers swirling in velvet, the faceless figure behind them. Adam's final message, not just an accusation but a confession of sorts, of fear, of despair, and yet also a final act of authorship. Even in death, the artist had taken control of the canvas. Poirot tapped his finger softly on the window, his mind returning briefly to Sylvie Lemaire. She had left the drawing room in silence after Poirot's revelation, but her silence had not been one of guilt. It had been one of recognition. She had seen herself in his words. Perhaps, he thought, she would grow from it. She had not intended to harm Adam, but intentions were not the only currency in human affairs. Sometimes absence could wound more deeply than presence. Then there was Madeleine, steady, poised, dutiful, and yet so afraid of seeing the full depth of Adam's pain that she had dismissed it. Poirot had watched her face as he spoke in the drawing room, the tight line of her mouth, the way her hands gripped the fabric in her lap. She had been holding back tears not of guilt, but of helplessness. She had thought herself a pillar. She had not realized she was part of the weight. Gideon Vale would recover, Poirot suspected. He was too self-assured to carry guilt for long, but perhaps, in his quieter moments, he would remember that Berlin sculpture, that sketch Adam had shown him years before, and perhaps, just perhaps, he would feel the faint sting of shame. As for Henry Arledge, the theatre director had left the room with his mask intact, his voice measured, his nod courteous. But Poirot had seen the stiffness in his posture, the way his eyes had darted once, only once, toward the window before he departed. It had been the look of a man suddenly made aware that others had been watching all along. Only Verena Moore had remained still, silent, grounded. She had offered no defense, no rebuttal. She had simply listened. And in the end, Poirot had nodded to her, not as accuser to accomplice, but as one witness to another. Verena had seen the slow unraveling. She had chosen, as many do, to survive rather than intervene. It was not admirable, but it was human. The train whistled softly as it passed a stand of poplars, their leaves whispering in the wind. Poirot opened his notebook again, turning to a clean page. In small, precise handwriting he began to write, "The tragedy of Adam Fosbury was not that he died unloved. It was that he died unheard. The artist lives in translation, each emotion filtered into color, each thought into form. When the world ceases to read those translations, the artist begins to fade. And yet, even in his final hours, Adam attempted one last translation. A faceless figure, a dancer in shadow, a name etched beneath a smear of wax. He turned death into art because it was the only language he truly trusted. He closed the notebook and leaned back, eyes closed, letting the rhythm of the train soothe him. When Poirot returned to London that evening, he declined an invitation to dine with acquaintances and instead returned to his flat on Whitehaven Mansions. He made himself a light supper, roast quail with olives and thyme, and drank a tisane by the fire. The city hummed beyond the windows, but inside all was calm, order restored. Later he rose and crossed to the corner cabinet where he kept his case journals. He took down a folder, labelled it in his usual meticulous script, "The affair at Young Men in Velvet, Devonshire, October. Fosbury estate closed. Monsieur Hercule Poirot." He placed it on the shelf between the Crows at Beaufort Lane and the Mirror in Belgravia. And then he stood for a long moment, fingers lightly touching the spines of old investigations, recalling names and moments, some bitter, some sweet, but always truthful. Poirot turned out the light in his study and retired to his bedroom. Before sleep, he reflected not on Simon Quill, nor even on Adam Fosbury. He thought instead of the faceless figure in the painting. How many such figures had he encountered in his life? The ones behind the crime, not always the hand that acted, but the silence that allowed it, the pressure that made it possible. The unacknowledged accomplice. He would see others, he was certain. Human nature did not change, but with every case, every truth exposed, he chipped away at the shadow. And for tonight at least, that was enough. Poirot closed his eyes and slept. The next morning, Whitehaven Mansions stood in its usual elegant stillness, the faint echo of early traffic barely brushing the thick curtains drawn across Poirot's tall windows. The scent of breakfast, fresh brioche, preserved lemon peel and a single boiled egg, drifted into the sitting room from the small but fastidiously ordered kitchen. Poirot had risen early, as was his custom after a case, while many detectives collapsed into days of rest. Poirot found solace only in structure. Order, as always, was the balm. He had dressed immaculately as though an audience waited for him, though none did. Dark plum waistcoat, white linen shirt, and shoes polished to a quiet gleam. His tie was a soft gold, tied to a perfect measure. He seated himself at the breakfast table. A knock came at the door, 2 crisp taps and a pause. He already knew who it would be. "Entree," Poirot called gently. It was Miss Felicity Lemon, his secretary, precise in both form and duty. She entered with a folder tucked under one arm and a newspaper under the other. "Good morning, Monsieur Poirot. I trust Devonshire was eventful." "Ah, Mademoiselle Lemon," he said with a faint smile. "Eventful, yes, though not in the manner. The newspapers enjoy." He gestured to the chair opposite. "Will you take coffee?" "I've already had mine, thank you," she said briskly, placing the folder on the table. "Correspondence from Scotland Yard, and this," she held out, "The Times, which has chosen to take a rather theatrical view of your investigation." Poirot accepted the paper with interest, turning it open to the society section. There, beneath a somewhat florid headline, "Murder in Velvet, Tragedy in the Artist's Circle," was a polished account of Adam Fosbury's death, written with that distinct tone of affected sympathy and thinly veiled gossip. Quill's name had been omitted, replaced with "a prominent art columnist now under investigation." The article danced carefully around motive, instead framing the incident as a dramatic footnote to a decadent circle of bohemian elites. Poirot raised a brow. "So they continue to treat the truth as an accessory, no?" Miss Lemon gave a faint shrug. "People prefer suggestion to certainty, particularly when certainty feels dull." Poirot folded the paper neatly. "The truth is never dull, mademoiselle, only obscured." He set it aside and opened the folder she'd brought, letters mostly. Some from old clients, others from law firms. One note in particular caught his eye. A single sheet on thick embossed paper. He read it slowly, then he read it again. Miss Lemon noticed his pause. "Is something the matter?" Poirot's expression shifted, not with alarm, but with something close to melancholy. "It is from Verena Moore," he said softly. "The housekeeper." Miss Lemon tilted her head. "From the Fosbury estate?" "Oui." He handed the note to her. It was short, poised, sincere. Monsieur Poirot, you spoke of silence as an accomplice. I have thought of little else since. There's something I did not say. Not out of malice, but because I thought it would not change the outcome. And yet now I believe you were right. The truth deserves its place, even too late. Before Adam died, he had begun to write a letter. Not a suicide note, not quite, but a farewell. He left it in the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath the brushes. I found it the morning of his death and, ashamed of what it implied, I burned it. He had written only one line. If they will not hear me, let the painting speak. I thought you should know. I am sorry. Verena Moore, Miss Lemon, lowered the paper. Slowly. Then he intended it as a warning? Poirot nodded, eyes fixed on some distant point. As a voice, a last attempt to reach those who refused to listen while he lived. He rose and walked to the window, hands behind his back. Imagine, Mademoiselle, how deeply one must feel to leave not a note but a symbol, a figure faceless, a name half-carved. He knew he would not be believed, and yet he painted. That is the tragedy. Miss Lemon watched him quietly. It was a difficult case. No, Poirot said, turning back. The crime was simple. It is the aftermath that is complex. Simon Quill may face trial, but what of the rest? The ones who chipped away at Adam without ever drawing blood. How does society account for quiet cruelty, for elegant betrayals? Miss Lemon folded the letter and slipped it back into the folder. They live with themselves, she said simply, which may be the harsher sentence. Poirot regarded her with warmth. Mademoiselle Lemon, sometimes I believe you are the wiser of the two of us. That, she said, rising, is obvious. He smiled. As she departed, Poirot returned to the fire, settling into the armchair with his notebook once more. He turned to the final page of the Young Men in Velvet entry and added the following lines. Let the painting speak, he said. And so it did. But not just of guilt. It spoke of longing. Of the need to be seen clearly by those who look but never see. In the end, justice is not only the uncovering of the hand that kills, it is also the defense of the soul that dies first. Let it be remembered, not all murderers intend to kill. But all the same they do. He closed the notebook, stood and straightened his cuffs. The morning had grown brighter, the rain gone. Outside, the city moved without pause, unaware of the quiet reckoning that had just been recorded in a single tidy line of ink. Poirot took his hat from the stand by the door and placed it carefully upon his head. There were errands to run. New. Clients to meet. But for now he walked with no destination, letting the city unfold around him. The dancer had fallen, but the truth had danced on. The pavement glistened beneath Poirot's shoes as he stepped into the crisp London morning. The rain had left a faint shimmer upon the cobblestones, and the autumn breeze stirred the edges of fallen leaves into quiet spirals near the curb. It was a familiar street, tucked just off Hanover Square, where shops had not yet opened and the city's more harried rhythms had yet to begin. This was a time of day Poirot favoured, not for its stillness but for its potential. The world, before it began speaking loudly, often revealed truths it otherwise concealed. He walked with measured grace, his cane tapping lightly, not for need, but for rhythm, and his gaze gently sweeping across window panes, brass doorknobs, and the occasional early passer-by. His steps were not directionless, though he had told himself so. A part of him always moved toward something. Today it was not a clue but a reflection. Though the affair at Young Men in Velvet was closed, a residue of thought clung to Poirot's mind, not like a stain, but a scent that lingered even after the air had changed. In other cases, he had exposed criminals with clearer malice, clearer means. This case had been more porous. Simon Quill had acted with intent, yes, but not entirely with forethought. It was the kind of murder born not from a singular moment, but from the slow accumulation of opportunity and resentment. It required a different kind of justice, one that stretched beyond courtrooms and juries, one that asked society whether silence too was a kind of crime. As he turned onto Brook Street, Poirot passed a small gallery whose window display caught his attention. He stopped. There, in the warm light of a floor lamp, hung a single canvas. Modern, muted. A study in shadows and limbs, 4 figures in motion, all abstract save for their hands. The hands were meticulously painted, elegant and expressive, frozen mid-reach. The artist had left the faces incomplete, blurred, but those hands told stories, yearning, grasping, withdrawing. Poirot stood in stillness for several minutes. He did not read the placard. He did not need to. It was not Adam Fosbury's work, but it was born of the same lineage, a spiritual cousin. Art was never truly solitary. It left echoes in others. Some imitated, some responded. He finally turned away and resumed walking, his pace slightly slower. The case had concluded, yes, but the world around it continued shifting. He knew that, somewhere, perhaps even now, Gideon Vale was crafting a justification to tell himself that borrowing Adam's concept had been a form of tribute, that Henry Arledge had begun rewriting the memory of his role, adjusting the lines like a director, refining a dress rehearsal. And Sylvie, he imagined her still staring out the window of her flat, holding a cigarette she wouldn't smoke, wondering if she had, at some forgotten moment, truly loved the boy she let fall. Justice had landed like a stone in the water. But the ripples would take far longer to settle. Returning to Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot found a single envelope waiting at the front desk, its paper thick, its wax seal unbroken. He took it without expression and ascended the stairs, declining the lift for the satisfaction of motion. In his apartment, he placed his hat carefully on the rack and opened the envelope at his writing desk. The letter inside bore the monogram M.F., Madeleine Fosbury. Monsieur Poirot, I suspect you don't welcome further correspondence once a case is closed, but I find myself unable to remain silent. Your words linger, not in accusation but in clarity. You held up a mirror, and I, who pride myself on precision, saw only distortion in my own reflection. Adam was more fragile than I wanted to believe. I mistook his vulnerability for vanity. I told myself that offering him stability was enough, that affection did not need understanding. But I see now how easy it was to turn love into blindness. You were right. We did not strike the fatal blow, but we pulled the curtain shut, each in our way. I have arranged for the remainder of Adam's work to be curated, not by his former associates, but by a foundation in Devon that supports emerging artists. His studio will remain untouched for a time. Let others walk among his canvases and wonder. It is not justice, but it is memory. Sometimes that is all that remains. With respect, Madeleine Fosbury Poirot folded the letter with great care and placed it among his case notes. He did not reply. There were some sentiments best left as they arrived, raw, incomplete, sincere. The remainder of the day passed with a gentle routine. Poirot met an old friend for lunch at a quiet restaurant near Green Park, read a book on the psychology of gesture, and allowed himself the luxury of a second tisane at precisely 4 o'clock. But throughout it all there remained the faint awareness of something unresolved, not a mystery, but a sensation. At dusk, he took to the fireplace once more, settling into the chair as the flames climbed lazily in the hearth. He opened his notebook again. The young men in velvet case had filled several pages, each entry marked with his signature brevity and fastidious detail. But there was space left, a final note perhaps, not about the crime, but about the world it inhabited. He dipped his pen and began to write. In every room there are shadows. Some are cast by light, others by presence, and some by the absences we pretend not to notice. The faceless figure Adam painted was not just his betrayer. It was the figure we all fear, the one who watches, the one who knows, the one who says nothing. It was the embodiment of neglect given form, and in naming it he did not seek vengeance, he sought to be heard. In the end, he was. Not by the living, but by the canvas. Poirot paused. The fire crackled gently, casting flickers of gold across the floor. He signed the final line. HP setting the book down, Poirot stood and crossed to the window. The city lights blinked below like quiet thoughts, scattered and shimmering. Somewhere, beyond them, new crimes were unfolding, some bold, some quiet. some not yet begun, and he, Hercule Poirot, was ready, as always. The fire had burned low in the grate, casting long amber shadows against the polished parquet floor of Poirot's sitting room. Outside, the city pulsed quietly beneath a navy sky. Inside, all was still, save for the occasional turning of a page. Poirot sat in his high-backed chair, the very image of repose. But in his eyes was a spark, something unfinished, now finally coming to rest. He reached for the final folder, The Affair at Young Men in Velvet, and opened it for the last time. There, tucked between witness statements and personal notes, was a photograph of Adam Fosbury's final painting. Poirot studied it again, not for detail but for meaning, for what it had become since his return from Devon. In the weeks since Simon Quill's arrest, the case had remained in quiet limbo. Scotland Yard had compiled sufficient circumstantial evidence, intentional misrepresentation of provenance, threatening correspondence recovered from Adam's desk, and the damning forensic match on the wax, but whether the courts would convict on psychological provocation was another matter entirely. But Poirot did not dwell on that. For him, the question had always been more than legal. It had been philosophical. He leaned forward and touched the edge of the photo lightly, as though acknowledging not the work, but the man behind it. Adam had spoken, not in confessions, nor in outbursts, but in image. His entire life had been an act of translation, converting emotion into color, reflection into brushstroke. And when the world stopped listening to his voice, he spoke with silence, with shadow. With the subtle terror of being unrecognized by those closest to him, Poirot thought again of the faceless figure. That final ghostly smear behind the dancers, not just a representation of betrayal, but of legacy, of what remains when those who loved us forget how to look. There had been a time early in his career when Poirot believed that solving a case meant restoring order, that to name the guilty, expose the lie and walk away with boots unscuffed and conscience unburdened was enough. But he had grown older and wiser. Justice was not a lever. It was a mosaic, a slow, deliberate placement of pieces, some broken, some misaligned. Not every case would offer a perfect frame, but there was satisfaction in knowing that at the center of this one, a voice had been heard before it faded. Poirot reached for his fountain pen, black ink trimmed in gold, and drew a final line beneath the closing page of his report. The painting remains, and with it, the truth. He closed the file, secured it with a clip, and placed it upright in the wooden cabinet among the others. One case in a lifetime of them. And yet somehow it echoed more loudly than most. As he turned away from the shelf, a sound caught his ear, a knock at the door. 3 soft taps. Poirot opened it to find a young woman standing there, unfamiliar but hesitant only in posture. "Excuse." "Me," she said. "Are you Monsieur Poirot?" "I am," he replied warmly, noting the bundle in her hand, an envelope slightly worn. She extended it. "This is from someone named Sylvie. She asked me to bring it. She's left London for the continent." Poirot accepted the envelope gently and nodded his thanks. The girl disappeared into the hallway. Back inside, he opened the note. "Monsieur Poirot, I don't know what justice looks like anymore, but I've realized that indifference can wound more deeply than cruelty, that sometimes the harm we do comes from what we choose not to feel. Adam was many things, difficult, intense, dramatic, but he saw me more clearly than I wanted to admit. I think I owe him at the very least acknowledgement. You were right. Some murders happen slowly and some don't need weapons to be fatal. Thank you." S.L. Poirot refolded the letter carefully. He did not sigh. He did not smile. He merely set it on the mantel beside the photo of the painting. Then, with a glance at the clock, he crossed to his bureau and retrieved his gloves and hat. There was a recital at the Conservatoire that evening, an old acquaintance playing Ravel. Poirot, despite the case being closed, felt it only proper to attend. Some truths are best followed not by punishment, but by beauty. As he turned out the lights and closed the door behind him, the city's hush met him like an old friend. There would be other cases. But for tonight, Poirot allowed himself a rare, indulgence peace. And the knowledge that though the world had danced around Adam Fosbury's silence for too long, Poirot had heard the music and made sure it played one final time.